Hi, I'm Daniela Cruz, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Amon Museum of American Art, and I speak with curator John Rohrbach about their exhibition, Gordon Parks, The New Tide, Early Work, 1940 to 1950. Now for Art This Week. Hi, I'm here at the Amon Museum with John Rohrbach to talk about the exhibition, Gordon Parks, The New Tide, Early Work, 1940 to 1950. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So Gordon Parks had a long, illustrious photographic career. Can you talk about why this exhibition focuses on this particular period and the origin of the title, The New Tide?
Yes, we have taken note of many Gordon Parks shows that have been presented around the country over the last few decades. And we jumped at this opportunity because it really focuses on his origins, what brought him to the wide public acclaim that he used then as a launching point to do many other things. One of the remarkable things about Parks was that he was a Renaissance man in the oldest version of the terms. He was a composer, he was a musician, he was of course a photographer, he's a cinematographer, he was quite a good basketball player. Wow. And he was a debonair man about town. So to take somebody like that and look at his beginnings, in a way it's his origin story. It takes you from the time that he was a fledgling photographer to when he gets invited to become a staff photographer at the major picture magazine of the day. In a day where picture magazines, rather than video and the internet, were the outlet for main social discourse. Okay. In terms of the title is an interesting, the title gives you insight into that period. It's hard to remember back to the 1940s for many of us. Many of us, of course, were not alive at that time. But the 1940s were a critical time for the African American communities across the United States. It was a time of both uplift and difficulty. It was a time of virulent racism. It was a time of stereotyping. And it was also a time where the African American cultural community was starting to see itself come together and project a totally different view of African American life and African American abilities. And so the New Tide really takes its initial roots from a book put together and published by a philosopher named Alain Locke, who published a book called The New Negro in 1925, which is an anthology of writings by various African American scholars and writers. The tide part comes from Richard Wright with his publication in 1941 of 12 Million Black Voices, now a seminal work in not only African American history but in photographic history. And he ends that book on the last page talking about a new tide rising. We are part of that new tide, and you cannot help but pay attention to what we are able to do and what we're doing.
It's evident that Parks enjoyed photographing working class people from various backgrounds, yet he focused on the nuances of African American life. This is really noted in the series that has American Gothic and depictions of Ella Watson. Can you talk about his relationship with her?
It's an interesting relationship because Parks was still finding his way at that point. He was learning how to be a documentary photographer. In fact, he was on a fellowship in Washington to, for the first time, move into the trade of documentary photography. It was his first time to work with a professional darkroom. It was his first time to work around a whole crew of professional, top-of-the-line photographers. And when he arrived in Washington, his boss, Roy Stryker, said, first of all, you've got to photograph from your roots. You've got to photograph what you know. And not only that, so first of all, he sent him around Washington to learn what Washington was about and how it was different from Chicago. The second thing that he said is, it's not enough to make a single photograph. A single photograph doesn't really tell a story. And what we do as social documentarians is invite people into the lives and make them feel they're part of the lives of the people that we're photographing, to make people understand the circumstances around which those photographs come. And Stryker suggested that Parks look around the office and maybe talk to a couple of the women who cleaned the offices after hours. And Parks took that to heart. He started a project with 2 different women who were cleaning the offices and struck up such a rapport with Ella Watson that he continued that project for weeks, not only starting within the offices of the Farm Security Administration, which was part of the Department of Agriculture, and then moving into her home, into her church, and into her full life, so that one sees her not merely as an office worker, somebody who cleans the offices, but somebody as a human being, a family woman raising kids.
Parks described the camera as a weapon against poverty, racism, and discrimination. Can you talk about the social implications of the photo series Harlem Gang Leader?
Harlem Gang Leader was something that came out of Parks's own roots. He had wanted to do the story for about 3 years. He had worked out a storyline with the novelist Ralph Ellison. And it took him a while to convince Life magazine that this was a project he wanted to do. I say it came out of his roots because Parks grew up in Fort Scott, Kansas in very poor conditions. His father was a farmer. He was one of 15, the last of 15 children. And he faced poverty and racism growing up. So this was going back into a community, not rural, but in this case, urban, to try to understand the difficulties and humanize the life of somebody, a young person in Harlem. And he focused in and got the support, the trust of a 17-year-old boy named Leonard Red Jackson, who was a Golden Gloves boxer, who was also a leader of the gang who ran in his neighborhood. Now we think of gangs today and we think of drugs and violence and so on and so forth. While there were certainly guns and knives at that time, it wasn't as virulently violent as what we think of today, oftentimes with a more acute gang violence, particularly in Central America. And what Parks's goal was to humanize Red Jackson, to show him not only around the gang, but in the streets, at home with his mother, fixing bicycles for the children in the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. And he spent weeks with Red Jackson, made over 90 images, and then handed them over to Life, and then Life built the story. Parks didn't have control over the final story. The story that was presented in Life magazine tended to obscure some of the humanity of Red Jackson, but it had such force with Life's readership that Life took notice and said, we have a prize here in Gordon Parks. He's an amazing photographer who connects with our audience. And that's what induced Life, caused Life to turn to Parks and invite him to become a staff photographer.
Gordon Parks started photographing African American women in their everyday wear and then eventually photographed Paris fashion shows for Life magazine. What were the influences of Edward Steichen and Erwin Blumenfeld on his photography?
Parks was always looking at the work of other photographers, both social documentarians and fashion photographers. He became friends with Alexander Lieberman, who was an art director for fashion magazines in New York City, and in fact, Lieberman helped him get a range of jobs. Parks, if you go back to my point about his being a Renaissance man, all through his career, he not only was a social documentarian, but even after he took on that kind and focused on that kind of work, he was still doing fashion work, he was still doing spot photography, he was still doing portraits of people. He was somebody who could focus in many different directions at the same time. One of the things that struck me in looking at the photographs in the show that audiences may not immediately look at is how meticulous he was in his framing and his lighting. If you look at his images and see where he stood, where he positioned the camera, how he lit scenes. Ella Watson is a perfect example. Some of the early scenes of hers, he stuck lights on the floor to dramatize the scene of her working in these dark offices. This self-portrait that he made very early in the time period covered by the show gives you a sense of his forcefulness and his sense of self-presentation. He knew what he was doing, and he framed it beautifully.
Right. And notably, the framing is really stands out to me in a lot of the works that he did for Standard Oil Company when he worked in the Northeast, photographing a lot of the workers and the plants. Can you talk about that kind of industrial work and what that did to his overall body of work?
He took on the Standard Oil project with his mentor, Roy Stryker, who he had started working with in Washington. When Stryker shifted out of work for the government and took on basically a public relations job for Standard Oil of New Jersey. And when you shift from social documentary to public relations, you shift tacks to pay ever more attention to the graphic quality of the images. And what better way to do that than to look at the oil industry, because you've got all of these pipelines and you've got all of these tanks and so on where you have many repeating forms, and Parks took full advantage of doing that. The same time what he does is he goes into, from what he learned in Washington, he goes into workers' lives and people's lives, whether they be farmers and gasoline station owners in Maine, to people working in the plants, grease plants, oil plants, to humanize the lives of those workers. But at the end product, he knows, is public relations. And in public relations, just as with magazine work, you've got to grab somebody's attention right away because they're flipping through magazines and periodicals. And he does that with a clear graphic sense.
Parks was surrounded by a lot of artists and writers throughout his time in major cities. Can you talk about some of the most influential creatives in his life?
I'll do that, but I'll presage it. None of us gets to achieve what we achieve without help. And Parks took full advantage of that. Again, I mentioned early on, he was a debonair, outgoing person. He had a charismatic personality. But he also was a very driven person. And as he meets people, he takes advantage of those kinds of connections to help build his career. Richard Wright is a perfect example where as he learns about the book 12 Million Black Voices, he ends up meeting Wright and asks Wright to dedicate the book to him. He uses that book as his inspiration. Other people he met which were important to him was a woman in Minneapolis who also spent quite a bit of time in Chicago named Marva Trotter Lewis, who was the wife of the boxer Joe Louis. What made her important is that she was a fledgling fashion creator, dress creator. And she coaxed Parks into photographing her in some of her own creations. She also took a look at his images and helped support him, saying, I think I can get you some commissions, not only around Minneapolis, but in Chicago. I think I can get you a show in Chicago, and so on and so forth. Once he arrives in Chicago, he arrives into a milieu of artists and writers who are coming together through the creation of a community arts center. And that community arts center is so dynamic that it attracts others from the East Coast. It attracts not only Chicago painters like Charles White, who's painting a mural for the Chicago Public Library at the time, and Alan Locke, who puts together a major show of art by African Americans in Chicago in 1940, but also people like Langston Hughes, the poet who stops in Chicago to finish a book and decides he's going to stay and help start a writer's workshop. Or Richard Wright, who comes through town and helps to start a theater. So he connects with all of these people, asks them for advice, takes advantage of those connections, and that's what helps push him along to the next stage of his career.
Wow, that's really incredible. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
We want to thank John for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to cartermuseum.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your poem